key conversation today and are thrilled to talk through what we're calling the Common Endeavor webinar. And we are lucky today to have Ed Gabriel, former ambassador to Morocco and Keystone board member, and Paul Salem. He is the CEO of the Center, I'm trying to find your title here, Center for Middle East.
Center, Middle East Institute.
Middle East Institute.
I thank you all. I want to give a brief overview of today's conversation. We'll have about 30 minutes, and Ed and Paul, by the way, is in Lebanon and has assured us that should the electricity go out, there's a backup generator that will kick in and he'll be back. And then we'll just ask Ed to continue on until we get Paul started again. But we'll have about 30 minutes of a dialogue with Ed and Paul. Again, Ed is the former U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Morocco and president of the American Task Force for Lebanon. And then we will follow that with Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, please click the Q&A button on your screen and type a question in the box. You can send it anytime during the webinar. Our discussion is part of the Key Conversation series that features policymakers, congressional leaders, and other key policy influencers. And our previous conversations have been focused on things such as climate policy, law and enforcement with communities of color. These are timely, impactful conversation. And given all that has been in the news lately with the Mideast, I think this qualifies as one of the more important conversations we'll be having. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed and Paul for our discussion.
Thanks, Christine. It's great to be with you all. I'm sure there are many people on this call that we know doing these dog and pony shows, so to speak, probably as much as we see our own significant others. So Paul, welcome from Lebanon. I'm very happy you could be with us today. Paul is, yeah, there's a little bit of a delay. So if there's a little bit of space in between when I say something and Paul answers, you'll know why. We're several thousand miles apart. So Paul is, as Christine said, he's the president of the Middle East Institute. He's the author of several books and reports. I don't usually go through them all, but I think it's important for everyone on this call to understand who Paul is. Among his reports and books are Escaping the Conflict Trap, Towards Ending Civil Wars in the Middle East, Winning the Battle, Losing the War, which addresses the conditions that fuel armed non-state actors, From Chaos to Cooperation, Towards Regional Order in the Middle East. I mentioned to Paul last month, I wrote a report for CSIS, which was From Conflict to Cooperation, so about the Middle East. We'll have to compare whether or not our responses were the same. Broken Orders, The Causes and Consequences of Arab Uprisings. Thinking Arab Futures, which is drivers, scenarios, and strategic choices for the Arab world. The Reoccurring Rise and Fall of Political Islam. Bitter Legacy, Ideology and Politics in the Arab World. And the last one I have is Conflict Resolution in the Arab World. Now you know why Paul is part of the Keystone conversation, because he does in the Middle East what we at Keystone try to do in America, and that is develop conflict resolution models to hopefully bring people together towards a consensus on issues. So we have much in common with Paul. I should also say that, Paul, this is a special day. It happens to be the birthday of our founder, Robert W. Craig, who is the founder of the Keystone. Yeah, you're on a very special day. He was also the first director of the Aspen Institute. He's passed away, but he taught us really not only what we can do in the mountains in terms of bringing intellectual order and conversation in the mountains, but to have fun in the process. So prior to joining MEI, Paul was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, director of the Ferris Foundation, and founder and director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, which is Lebanon's leading policy think tank there. And I have to mention that Paul has a BA, an MA, and a PhD from Harvard. So folks, you're in good company with Paul, and he absolutely makes up for what I lack. That's for darn sure after reading this resume to you. Welcome, Paul.
Ed, thank you very much, and thank you, Christine, for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this Keystone Dialogue. I know how much you care about resolving conflict and finding pathways forward. As Ed indicated, that's kind of my life story. I grew up in Beirut during the Civil War, so ending conflict, trying to find peace, even in the darkest days, is kind of what drives me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I just landed in Lebanon a few hours ago, and as you may know, Lebanon is almost a failed state, and in some measurements is a failed state. So if the electricity goes off or the internet's sketchy, you'll know why. But it's a pleasure to be with you. Ed, back to you.
Thank you very much. Paul, if I may, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to start the dialogue off, and we'll take it from there with the audience. I should tell you that a large number of the people on this call may be from the energy sector. So think about that as you answer some of the questions. And I'm sure they're from other walks of life as well. So let me ask you the big broad question first, if I may. Let's just start across the region from Morocco to Iran. You know, I think there's at least a half a dozen countries that are failed or failing, probably more than a half a dozen. Interestingly, the monarchs are doing relatively well in the Middle East in comparison to these so-called fledgling democracies, and that's with little exception. So, Paul, give us a review of the region, if you will, with an understanding that many of us don't practice in the Middle East per se. So anything you can do to explain the interplay between the countries, some based on religion and or others based on their interest, and how does the U.S., Russia, and China play into these intertwined relationships? Floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ed. Let me start by saying that the Middle East and North Africa region, since you mentioned Morocco, so we'll include North Africa, is certainly going through a triple whammy of obviously a worldwide health crisis, unprecedented. The economic and socio-economic impacts of the health crisis, a contraction of the economies across the board to different degrees, which is causing a spike in unemployment, a spike in poverty rate. So that's that socio-economic crisis. And the second and the third crisis, and you mentioned energy, is the energy price crisis, which is partly linked to the downturn in global demand, but also to longer trends of fracking and to transition to other energies. So those three crises put the entire region in one of the most acute sort of region-wide crises it's been through in a very long time. The countries of the region are extremely varied from both economically and politically. You mentioned politically, some are monarchies and some are republics of different kind, and I'll get into that in a moment. Some are the wealthiest countries on the planet, and some are the poorest countries on the planet. So very, very varied. Some have a population the size of a small town in Connecticut, and some have a population of 100 million. So when you talk about the Middle East and North Africa, it's really an extremely varied chessboard. The failed states that you talked about, are critically important. Obviously, Syria has been the headlines for a long time, Iraq, on and off, Yemen, very tragically, and Libya. Those are in the Middle East and North Africa, and if you want to go further afield, Afghanistan. And there are some countries on the brink of complete failure, which is the country I'm in now, Lebanon. And on and off, Sudan has been on the brink. Jordan is a bit precarious. But you already have, between Libya, Syria, and Yemen, very, very grave failures. And without going into too much detail, the part of those failures is the dead end that many Arab countries faced in terms of their basic social and political contract. And that social and political contract, built effectively after decolonization, after World War II, was that the government would take away people's freedoms and rights, but would give them housing and public health and public schooling and public goods. And for a couple of decades, if you sort of look at the 50s and 60s, there really was what you might call a progressive developmental jump in the Middle East, and a lot of progress for societies, for women, for schooling, for health, many, many things. And then for a complex set of reasons, these authoritarian systems, which were initially forward-looking, revolutionary, sort of visionaries, all of them gradually sank into corrupt police states of one form or another, and some more repressive than others, that hooked up with crony capitalism, and that initial burst of progressive development turned through neoliberal economics and crony capitalism into extreme wealth inequalities, high levels of corruption, and high levels of repression. And that really is the set of circumstances that led to the revolts of 2011 and some of the revolts that continue to this day. There was a revolt in Sudan and Algeria in 2019. There was a revolt in Lebanon and Iraq in 2019. Some of those revolts continue, for example, the one in Lebanon and to some degree Iraq. And the problem there is that the Arab world, unlike Western Europe, I would say, has not come to agreement as to what political systems should be. As you mentioned, there are monarchies, which are clinging to a model of, monarchical family rule. And as you mentioned, we'll get into it in a minute, why are they doing apparently better than the republics? And then we had different kinds of republics. Some were led by the military, some were led by a party, a political party, and some, like Lebanon, and now like recently Tunisia and Iraq, have tried to evolve into electoral democracies. And each one has a very complex history and a complex theory. In brief, on the why have monarchies done better than the republics? First of all, if you look at the wider span of history, the Middle East used to be almost all monarchies, which included at the time Iraq, and for a while before the French came, Syria for a couple of years. Libya was a monarchy, and so on and so forth. Algeria was under the French, but previously was a monarchy. A lot of the monarchies fell in the first wave of revolution in the 1950s, where these countries turned into republics. And when you look at the monarchies, there are 8 monarchies in the Middle East. 6 of them are in the Gulf GCC members. All are oil rich or energy rich, so they have the peculiar advantage of having a lot of money to deal with their problems. So it's hard to say, are they doing well because they have money, or are they doing well because of or are they monarchies? And the other 2 are Jordan and Morocco, which are not oil rich. But in brief, my view of why the monarchies in this period have done better is that the republics, even the military regimes or one-party states, all claimed to be electoral democracies. They all claimed to have elections and to respect it. In that situation, the republics were, the leaders of the republics, the presidents, were in danger of being voted out of office. So the regime had to impose such repression to make sure that when elections were held, and they were, make sure they're rigged, make sure the opposition is in jail and all of that. Whereas the king of Jordan or the king of Morocco or the Emir of Kuwait, can hold elections for parliament, and his rule as king or emir never comes into it and is never made on electoral basis. So he doesn't have to repress, and he can have a measure of democratization without that measure of democratization threatening the monarchy. So it gives them certainly wiggle room. You asked a lot of questions, Ed, in the beginning. Let me just say a few things about the regional dynamics and a couple of things about the global dynamics. In the regional dynamics, you have basically three axes in the Middle East today. One axis is the Iranian axis and its allies, which is Iran, and it has proxies in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, and with a very clear set of policies. And you have used to be in the shadows, now it's come out into the open, a GCC or some of the GCC countries with Egypt and now with Israel forming an axis, which is obviously very close to America, very hostile to Iran in particular, and in some cases very hostile to Turkey. And the third axis is Turkey and its junior partner Qatar, and that is another axis which supports a different version of political Islam than Iran does. Iran supports a Shiite version. Turkey and Qatar support a sort of mainstream Muslim Brotherhood type of Sunni political Islam. Those three axes are fighting it out currently in the Middle East. Globally, the US remains by far the hegemonic power in the Middle East, will remain so into the foreseeable future. Russia definitely has a foothold in Syria, but doesn't have much wiggle room or much room to expand, partly because it doesn't actually have that much to offer strategically for the bigger countries in the region, and the US already provides that for those countries in the region. And then the emerging giant, of course, is China, but China is focusing on hoovering up or vacuuming up all the oil and gas it can find, and building its one road, one belt infrastructure, and doing as much trade and infrastructure trade as it can. So far, keeping itself out of geopolitics and out of the pesky alignments that bedevil American policy or Russian policy, and is happy to sit back and receive the oil of the region, which the US ensures that it gets out of the Persian Gulf and largely goes to India and China and Japan. The US keeps trade routes open through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and China is thankful for that. So China doesn't have big geopolitical ambitions in the near term in the Middle East, but obviously 15, 20 years from now, if they continue to grow at the rates they are, it's anybody's guess where we will be. And I'll stop there, Ed. That was a very long opening set of responses.
Not at all. I think it's a good overview of the region so that our listeners and participants get a good feel for your thinking in the region. President Trump was in the news this week being instrumental in conducting normalization agreements separately between Israel with UAE and separately with Bahrain. Give us your thoughts on these agreements, Paul. What's good about them? And if you have any concerns moving forward as a result of these agreements.
Well, they're very, very significant agreements. And they were agreements that really were generated by momentum from the UAE. And then after the UAE made clear its intention, Bahrain was encouraged to go in that direction as well. The Trump administration was present, was, yes, maybe a mediator in some cases, but this was really two bilateral agreements between two sets of countries, UAE and Israel, Bahrain and Israel, in the region, who for their own bilateral reasons decided that this is best for them. For the UAE and Bahrain, this is a long time coming. This is not, didn't happen overnight. It is driven by two sets of concerns and ambitions and I would pivot it around the UAE in particular. The UAE is a 21st century country. It's looking decades down the road. It sees that Israel is an incredible technological, educational, economic know-how hub. The UAE is trying to leapfrog forward into the 21st century. They've already done a tremendous job in getting there from scratch. 30 years ago, as you know, Ed, there was nothing there. And they are now one of the most advanced governments and economies in the world. So there was, at that level, a kind of a no-brainer that, you know, which are the futuristic countries and innovative economies in the region. The UAE looked around, and obviously it's not Iran, it's not Turkey, it's not Egypt, it is Israel. The second very urgent concern was the UAE's fears of Iran. Iran is the giant neighbor. Iran is a very hostile neighbor. Many attempts to encourage Iran to behave more like a state and less like a revolution have not brought real change. The UAE is extremely vulnerable. That is why they have such a close relationship with the United States. But obviously for them, having a close security relationship with Israel is a bit of a no-brainer too. Given Israel's high-tech capacities, their drone capacities, their intelligence capacities. They've been in Iran and done, you know, amazing things just in the last few months. So when the UAE looks across the lake there and sees Iran, definitely having a strong partner is a plus for them. Bahrain, similar considerations, but I would say in the case of Bahrain, Bahrain doesn't make any move without Saudi Arabia encouraging them to do so. I wouldn't call Bahrain a protectorate of Saudi Arabia, but in a way it is. So the peace treaty between Bahrain, or the promise of a peace treaty between Bahrain and Israel, must really be read in light of a Saudi green light to go ahead and do so. In Saudi Arabia, they might not be ready to take the same upfront kind of position, at least maybe not now, but they share exactly the same ambitions and concerns that the UAE does, and hence have the same logic that the UAE and Saudi Arabia would have. Now, all of these countries obviously would have done this decades ago, were it not for their concern about the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian issue. And this remains a major concern and a major issue. And this is where it kind of dovetails with US policy, in the sense that the Trump administration had given such a strong green light to Bibi Netanyahu and his government in Israel that Netanyahu was on the verge of annexing large segments of the West Bank, which really would have been the complete end of any possibility of a peace process, and would have been a game changer in a negative sense for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that they could no longer normalize with Israel if Israel goes that far. So that created an opportunity where the UAE said to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu already had realized he wasn't going to be able to go ahead with it. So the UAE said, you know, look, why don't you put this annexation on hold? In exchange, you normalize with us, we normalize with you. You can sell that to the Israeli public as a win. We can sell it to Trump as a win, even though you wanted annexation and you're not going to get annexation. So there was a moment where these sort of lines met. The Palestinian issue remains a hair trigger issue, a very explosive one. And a lot of efforts must be focused now on helping the Palestinians and the Israelis and encouraging them to go back to the negotiating table and to take advantage of the fact that Israel is not alone in the region. Israel is not isolated. Israel has Egypt, has Jordan, has Bahrain, has the UAE, in effect, has Saudi Arabia. So Israel can afford now to be more generous and more lenient, less of a fortress state, if more of its neighbors are friendly rather than hostile. And that's hopefully where we should try to go.
Under a Trump administration, is the two-state solution dead?
I don't think, the two state solution in the sense that Palestine or the Palestinians are going to get a normal sovereign state has been dead for many, many years. The Israeli settlement patterns in the West Bank have made it absolutely impossible to set up anything that looks like a state. And the Israelis have said again and again that under no circumstances would they give up major sovereignty, security rights to another completely different sovereign state. So in effect, people talk about the two-state solution or the one-state solution. The two-state solution is, a complete Palestinian state like Jordan or Egypt or so on. That, I think, is unfortunately impossible. Then they say, well, maybe it's one state and the Arabs get equal vote and equal rights and just ask for their rights in Israel. And that's a no-go because, the Israelis have declared it a Jewish state. They want to maintain a Jewish majority. So I think the direction we're going to have to go in is the gray zones, which used to be more common before World War II, where you don't have a fully sovereign state, but you have a lot of things. If you look at the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, it has a parliament, it has a flag, it has a budget, it has a foreign policy, it has its own army, but it's part of Iraq. So I think we're going to have to look at innovative constitutional arrangements and political arrangements. And it's also physically, whereas Gaza one day could be, a unified entity of some kind, the West Bank is going to be like New York and Brooklyn and Queens. I mean, they're going to have to live together in a very complex set of arrangements. So it's going to take a lot of creative constitutional thinking. But I do think that if the Israelis begin to actually see that the Arab world and the Muslim world is friendly, not hostile, then it's less of an issue if a few Palestinians, down the road, have something. What the fear was that a Palestinian state was going to be backed by a hostile Arab world, and in the Israeli memory, they've been through many wars. That has continued vis-a-vis Iran, but it is being eliminated vis-a-vis the big Arab countries.
Thanks, Paul. That's very helpful. Let's go to the country of our mutual origin, Lebanon. People took to the streets over a year ago, having had it with this corrupt government, a lack of electricity, no garbage pickup, no transparency in government transactions, and a refusal to even meet international norms for reform, not to mention the bloated bureaucracy based on giving jobs to loyal partisans by sectarian leaders who control the country. Lebanon was actually faced with a collapse of its banking system due to what I call a Ponzi scheme of kicking their debt down the road by paying large interest rates to banks and investors willing to invest in a dollarized euro bonds to support a debt and corrupt government. Now, this all came to roost when the government finally couldn't pay off the bonds when they came due. They were already faced with the collapse of its banking system as that happened. And beyond that, Lebanon hosts the largest per capita number of refugees in the world, making up more than 20% of its population and putting tremendous stress on an already weak infrastructure and a weak economy. We haven't even gotten to the pandemic yet. The pandemic hit and affected Lebanon like every other country in the world, further weakening an already limping economy. But the final kick in the ass was the fires blamed on government incompetence. It's said to be the largest explosion since the nuclear explosions ending World War II. Needless to say, Paul, I think you'll agree with me, and tomorrow I guess you'll see the effects of it when you go through town. the Lebanese people are really left hopeless. And many of the young who can depart the country are leaving. So it's a very tough situation in Lebanon right now. So my question, Paul, is what the heck is going on? What short and long term can the U.S. and the Lebanese do to crawl out from this disastrous fate? And I do mention both the U.S. and Lebanese. Thank you.
Yep, Ed, I think you laid out the grim realities very well. It's also important, you know, for us to note that Lebanon has in it Hezbollah, which is you know, armed group, backed, armed, financed, and directed by Iran, which has more firepower than the Lebanese army, which is quite not a bad army. The Lebanese army is small but effective. Hezbollah has been armed and trained by Iran to stand up to Israel. So you can imagine how powerful and effective they are. Hezbollah has also introduced itself into the political system in Lebanon. 1/3 of the population is Shiite Muslim. Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon. It wins elections, and they're in the Shiite districts. It is allied with another long-standing Lebanese Shiite movement called the Amal movement, and they are in political alliance. So Hezbollah, with its ally Amal, has tremendous power in the state and has the military power and the will to use it to block any decision that it's not happy with. So Lebanon is a country which does not have sovereignty. Lebanon cannot control its borders. It could not control its port, which is one of the reasons maybe that explosive nitrate oxide was in the port in the first place. It cannot control its airport. So it doesn't have the basic attributes of state sovereignty. That also means the state cannot collect all taxes or tariffs in all areas. It means that Hezbollah can smuggle anything at any time. So in addition to the security and sovereignty issues that Hezbollah introduces, it also cripples the finances of the government because it benefits from, you know, the country and the state, but it doesn't pay anything into it, and it smuggles and it violates customs and all of that, so it doesn't provide any revenue at all. In addition, it has used its muscle to push its allies into positions of power in Lebanon. According to an international investigation, assassinated the former powerful prime minister of Lebanon, Rafiq al-Hariri, and has been able to cow and manhandle his son, who is not as powerful, and sort of Hariri's son has been prime minister a couple of times, but prime minister under the thumb of Hezbollah, and they've also managed to maneuver their ally from the Christian community, Michel Aoun, into the presidency. So the officials of the state owe their presence to a militia, not to the people. So hence, corruption goes unchecked. You know, even if people protest on the street, they're backed by a militia. So in a sense, why should they care? Yet, this revolt, which Ed mentioned and started in October, is still ongoing. And despite everything that I've said, Lebanon does have regular elections to parliament, and parliament decides the entire distribution of power in the state. And the events of the past few months have dramatically shaken the political cards in Lebanon. And if and when there are parliamentary elections again, and they're due in 2022, they might bring some change to parliament, which might bring some beginnings of hope. But at the time being, the situation is stalemated. The government is bankrupt. The central bank is bankrupt. The private banks are effectively bankrupt, but are not. Basically, their doors are closed and they just give small payments. So they're not allowing a run on the banks, but they're effectively bankrupt. The French President Macron has been very proactive in trying to save Lebanon from itself, and has been to Lebanon twice and is coming back in December, and has laid out a roadmap for the Lebanese politicians to follow. And he said, you just follow these basic steps and I will assure you some international support. Even those basic steps, so far, this corrupt oligarchy backed by Hezbollah has failed to or refused to move forward. In the meantime, Lebanon is a very valuable country. As Ed said, it hosts a lot of refugees. A lot of Lebanese might become refugees if things come worse, and might end up in Europe and other places. Lebanon and the United States have a very long history together, dating back to the 19th century. There's a huge Lebanese diaspora in the United States that is, in some cases, a century old. And Ed leads the American Task Force for Lebanon, which represents that community. There's a lot of shared values, a lot of shared cultural values. Lebanon is also the only country in the Middle East, and I dare say in the world, where Christians and Muslims, Sunnis and Shias generally live together, govern together, not terribly well, I'll grant you that, but that is a very rare thing in the region, I would say the world. So whatever we can do to help on the US point of view, and Ed and I have collaborated a number of efforts, I think is definitely valuable.
Thanks, Paul. I've got one or two other questions, if I may, and then we can turn it over to you,
Yes, 'cause
Christine.
we have folks in the queue for chat too. So if we could leave a
Okay.
few minutes for that, that'd be terrific.
Let me ask just one more, which is the 800-pound gorilla question about Iran. Thanks, Christine. Let's discuss Iran just for a second. Can you explain the interplay between the Gulf and Iran and its influence in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon? What do you see as the difference between a Trump and a Biden administration towards Iran? And what do you think is going to happen in this regard under either scenario? And what do you believe is the best scenario?
I would say that the main conflict in the region, which is 41 years old since the Islamic Revolution, is between Iran and the United States. The Iranian Revolution was against the Shah, and it was against the United States backing the Shah. It was a response to the 1953 US-backed coup. And the Islamic Republic of Iran's leadership for the last 41 years has believed and convinced itself, or believes, that the United States, at the end of the day, wants regime change in Iran. And they know that the US is powerful enough to achieve that. And they saw that the US would, easily, in a few weeks, did regime change in Iraq. In a few weeks, did regime change in Afghanistan, did it in Libya. Iran was going to be next. So they are convinced that America is out to get them. And like many, some of that is true, because there are those in the US, some US administrations, and some including in this administration, who would like to do that. But also when somebody is paranoid, it's hard to convince them otherwise, in the sense that, President Obama said, look, we're not out to get you. We don't want regime change. He extended a hand. Let's go in a different direction. And we did get a valuable nuclear deal, but Iran said, fine, this guy, Obama's a nice guy, but he's there for 4 years, 8 years, then what? And indeed, proving their paranoia correct, they got a different administration. So I do think that a Biden administration can make limited progress with Iran, but very important. I think that on the nuclear file, there's a lot of real progress to be made by going back into the nuclear agreement and then engaging in further nuclear talks to extend the sunset clauses maybe indefinitely. I think Iran is open to that. It doesn't want a nuclear bomb, so it's willing to talk about that. But when you mentioned Iran's problems with Israel or with the Gulf, they regard Israel and the Gulf as proxies for the United States. And as long as they don't, as long as they believe that at any moment a US administration can revert the regime change, they need what they perceive as advanced forces to deter the United States. Why is Hezbollah in Lebanon? Hezbollah is their aircraft carrier. They don't have aircraft carriers. They can't have an aircraft carrier parked next to New York, so they park one next to Tel Aviv. And they say to the Americans, if you go after us, we're going to go after your friends. And they have forces parked in Yemen now. If you go after us, we're going to go after your Saudi friends. So this is the nature of this conflict trap, and that was one of the name of one of the books that we're in a trap, you know, and it's going to take a long. It's the work of generations to diffuse that. But I think a Biden administration can make a deal. I think a second Trump administration can make a deal. They were waiting to see if Trump was the one-term president. If so, they'll wait him out. If he's a two-term president, they can't wait him out. They have to talk. And Trump would love to make a deal. You know.
Christine, over to you.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. Really, really insightful comments. So much appreciated. And Paul, your Lebanon connection has been brilliant. So that's terrific.
Who knew? Okay.
Who knew? Just a couple of questions that we have time for. Can you give us some more details on how Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria are progressing politically and economically? And that's really for both of you.
Well, I'll leave Morocco to the Moroccan, Mr. Ed Gabriel. But let me say, I mean, when other countries in the region look to Morocco, it's a positive example. You mentioned a monarchy, but it's been very progressive. And I'll let Ed talk about Algeria and Tunisia. Obviously, they're very different systems in very different places. Tunisia is a rare success story politically in the region. It was on the brink of failure. It was on the brink of civil strife, but it jumped forward through negotiation and through inclusivity to agree a common constitution, a democratic constitution. They talked down the Islamist movement from its maximalist demands, and the Islamist movement accepted sort of the secular national general outlines of a national constitution and agreed to abide by those rules, something the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood refused to do. So Tunisia is a tentative but promising political example of a democracy that's trying to make itself work. Sadly, Tunisia doesn't have oil. Algeria has lots of it, energy and oil and gas. So the Tunisian economy is in just dreadful shape. You know, that's a whole story in itself. They're also impacted by climate change. They have a terrorism problem because they're right next to Libya. But it is generally a positive story. Algeria is a completely different story, military rule, also extremely rich in the sense that the state has massive energy resources. But Algeria last year had a revolt, had a revolution. And they too, like Sudan in 2019, have been trying to find a way forward. I think the Sudanese example has been more democratic and more positive, but the Algerian example, not altogether negative, but a very tense situation, particularly because oil prices have plummeted so severely. And that puts Algeria in a very tight spot. But over to you, Ed.
So let me just be quick. In Libya, what we're hearing this week is that the two opposing factions, one is on the being supported by Turkey and Qatar, I believe. The other has UAE, Egypt, and Russia behind it, have met in Morocco. And the word is that they may be reaching some kind of a framework to move forward. We'll see. On Algeria, I heard just this morning that their massive reserves, which have really helped them sustain deficit spending and pay off the people and buy some quiet in the country, is coming to an end. They may be pretty much use up their reserves by the end of the year. So next year will be interesting for Algeria to be, if not at the end, at the lowest point in their reserve requirements. Reserves meaning their money reserves, their foreign or their money reserves. In Morocco, I agree with you. The first 10 years of King Mohammed was nothing short of remarkable. What we have there is a benevolent king who really cares about his country and wants to do good. The last 10 years have been slower. Some say it's because they've got to deal with terrorism and other elements there that they've got to control while they make change. But overall, it's really been a model for change. The question will be in Morocco, are they moving fast enough towards change to satisfy its people or not? And so far, so good.
Let me mention, Christine, and I'll see what Ed has been hearing, but I've been hearing the last few days apropos of the UAE and Bahrain signing peace agreements with Israel. The other three countries that have been mentioned as possibilities are Oman, Sudan, and Morocco. And somebody was telling me, you know, through the DC grapevines that the Moroccans were approached as to whether they would normalize relations with Israel. And they said, sure, they have a big Jewish community, they have historic relations. And they said, sure, we'd be happy to if America would recognize our sovereignty over the Western Sahara issue. So I don't know what you've been hearing, but that's a major sticking point between the Moroccans and the Algerians. Yeah.
I don't believe it, by the way.
Okay.
I think people underestimate, and I wrote an op-ed on it. I actually wrote an op-ed predicting he would not sign a normalization agreement. And then the following week, the reasons why he did not. A lot has to do with whether or not he's going to play into U.S. politics. For over 2 centuries, they've avoided playing into a political year. Secondly, they would have a hefty price to pay given their support for the Palestinian people. It goes right down to the grassroots level in that sense. So I don't see it. Will they make overtures, maybe have flights back and forth, tourism? Yes. And will they be the next to go once they see a movement on Palestine? Yes, but not until.
Very good. Excellent. Next question. How would you characterize Turkey's goal in the region from Libya to the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean to Syria and Iran?
Very good question. Well, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the major struggle, there are two parts to it, but the main part is struggle for the future of basically offshore gas, prospecting, production, and transport to Europe. That is the struggle that the Israelis are in, the Egyptians, the Russians are trying to butt in, the Greeks are very much involved, the French are involved, and the US, maybe not in the major way, but they hover in the background. Turkey, a decade ago, saw itself as the future hub for hydrocarbons between the Middle East and also Central Asia, pipelines running through Turkey to Europe. The Iraqi pipelines run through Turkey to Europe. So the major struggle for the Eastern Mediterranean, a lot of it is over the future of hydrocarbons. And the UAE signing a deal with Israel enables it also to be a hydrocarbon player in future pipelines in the region. And the pipeline that the Israelis and the Egyptians and others are contemplating, well, 10 years ago when Turkey and Israel had reasonable relations, the cheapest way is to build a pipeline to Turkey and then Turkey would get it to Europe. But because of political differences, now they're thinking of pipeline to Cyprus, Cyprus to Greece, and then Greece to Europe. But that's very expensive. So that's a lot of what's going on there. Nearer to home, in Syria and Iraq, President Erdogan considers those his near abroad. Considers those areas which are of grave concern to Turkey, particularly because that's where the main existential threat in his mind to Turkey comes from, which is from the Kurdish communities in northern Iraq and northern Syria, which is why he's insisted in having a buffer zone in Syria. He maintains troops in northern Iraq, and his ambitions there are very firm. The Russians, backed by the Iranians and the Assad regime, are trying to push him out of Syria, which is partly why he is sending mercenaries to Tripoli, doing pushback there against what the Russians and the UAE. There's partly that, and it's partly securing the Eastern Med, and he has an agreement with the government of Tripoli as to how the waters are to be partitioned. Erdogan essentially is a leader on the ropes. He is a leader who lost the last local elections. His family has been mired in corruption. He's very vulnerable to political defeat. So he's also milking the Islam card, the ideological card, milking it for all it's worth. And he is also milking the nationalist card of defending Turkey, sending troops here and there, standing up to others in order to maintain his domestic survivability. So it's a very difficult game he's playing internally, and hence, whereas President Erdogan and Prime Minister Erdogan in the 1990s was the most business-oriented, peace-oriented, friends with everybody leader, he's now among the most conflictual, combative, Islamist. He's a different leader. It's a different Turkey. And very difficult to see how Turkey can move on from that until he's out of office.
Thank you. And the last question, I think you've largely answered, but just wanted to acknowledge the question. Today is the anniversary of Sabra and Shatila. What is the collective view and mood of the Lebanese today, long forgotten versus a backdrop and reminder of a horrific zeitgeist?
That was a horrific episode in a horrific civil war that lasted for 15 years in Lebanon. That was one of the darkest episodes of that war. The Lebanese and the Palestinians went through hell. Nobody wants to go back, which is why, despite everything, people don't want to go back into a conflictual situation. It reminds us also of the plight of the Palestinians and the Palestinian refugees in many parts of the world, but including in Lebanon, who live in extremely miserable conditions. And that's the fault of the Lebanese and the Lebanese government. But also the US has cut off all aid to UNRWA, which sort of helped them out. These Palestinians who have homes and towns in what is now Israel have not been allowed to go back to any part of Palestine. So that tragedy continues to play out generation after generation. And talk about despair and hopelessness. I mean, Palestinian refugees, let alone the millions of Syrian refugees and others, are really exemplars of that. It's a very sad situation. I would hope that these new openings from Arab countries to Israel might encourage, again, over time, Israel to moderate, to lighten up, to let these people come back to parts of the West Bank, to resume a national life, because really they don't threaten Israel. Israel is one of the strongest countries in the world. If it now has allies and friends throughout the region, it should not be so scared of the Palestinians.
Thank you. We are out of time, and
Christine,
yes.
May I ask one last question of him?
Yes.
We have 2 or 3 minutes, so if you don't mind, I'm like her older brother, so she's going to have to allow me to.
Yeah, I'm used to it.
I miss you too. Anyway, Paul, this has been like a graduate course in the last hour. It's been a phenomenal tour of the Middle East. Thank you so much. But I'd love to ask you a kind of a philosophical question. If you're advising the next administration, whether it's Trump or Biden, what would your advice be concerning U.S. policy in the region? But, try to give us the sense of the principles that you would tell an administration to follow when it comes to developing policy in the Middle East. I'm sorry, Christine, I had to ask that question.
No, it's good. If we run a couple minutes long, that's fine by us.
Yeah, I think, and I've written a lot about this, and it's a complicated question, but the way to frame the answer for me is to be realistic and moderate in understanding U.S. interests and in laying out U.S. policies. The Bush administration thought that, it's sort of like the Goldilocks situation. They went in too hot, they tried to do too much, and they broke a lot of stuff along the way and created a mess. The Obama administration initially tried to get out and created a lot of vacuums, and then ISIS showed up, and then they had to come back. So I think the areas where U.S. policy should be constructed is in the realistic, moderate middle. What is achievable in the Middle East is limited but valuable. There are certain areas of U.S. policy which really don't need revisiting. The presence in the Persian Gulf is fine, energy flows are fine. The counterterrorism war, yes, has been costly and so on, but it's more or less, kept the U.S. safe. ISIS has been moved out of the way. We and all of our allies are keeping an eye on ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's an ongoing threat. You can't walk away from it. You cannot, you have to keep doing that, and that's doable. Our economic relations are fine. They don't need major revision. Energy is fine. The dollarization with the Gulf is fine. So there are a lot of areas which don't need enormous revision. I think in the Israeli-Arab track, the next administration has been given a gift that, here's a door, let's walk through it. If we can get Morocco and Sudan and Saudi Arabia and others to go walk through that door and get the Israelis and the Palestinians to walk through their door, this is now more achievable than it ever was. That is tremendous. That's something to do. With the Iranians, we talked about it a little bit, get back into the nuclear deal, resolve the nuclear issue, which they're willing to talk about. However, be aware that Iran is going to remain Iran. It's sort of like how we had to deal with the Soviet Union. You negotiate détente, arms control agreements, you keep diplomacy open, but they're not going to be, they're still going to be the Soviet Union until they're not. And that means that Iran is going to stay in Lebanon, it's going to stay in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and maybe other places. In that arena, I would say, let's not escalate in those areas. Let's try to de-escalate. We're not going to be able to resolve it, but try to de-escalate Yemen, de-escalate Syria, de-escalate Iraq, protect Lebanon from complete collapse, and look for achievable results. The Yemeni civil war can be de-escalated. The Libyan civil war you were mentioning can be de-escalated. So there are a lot of what you might call medium-level wins, which won't resolve the entire, Middle East situation. But if we can de-escalate with Iran, de-escalate some of these civil wars, including some which Turkey is involved with, then that's important. The one structural thing I would say is that we need to go back to leading with powerful diplomacy. That means diplomacy, but it means powerful diplomacy. I do think Obama got it right with Iran. He sanctioned the hell out of them, but he said, look, I'm willing to talk. We haven't been able to achieve that with the Trump administration. Great sanctions, very powerful, but no talk, and hence no end game. And I'm hopeful that in a second Trump administration, he himself, if he's reelected, would be more deal oriented and could afford to make deals because he doesn't have to look behind his shoulder. And certainly, if there's a Biden administration, there's a lot of diplomatic heft there, and I know that they would lead with robust diplomacy.
Thank you. And I think that was a terrific question to end on. And you gave us hopeful pathways forward. So I also like that note to this conversation. And thank you, Ed, for recognizing Bob Craig's birthday today. It's a special day for our organization, and he would have loved this. So I think it's perfect that we held this conversation today. So with that, I will close our webinar. I want to thank Ed Gabriel, Keystone board member and former ambassador to the Kingdom of Morocco, and Paul Salem, president of the Middle East Institute. I think you've left people wanting more. So we'll tap you again post-election. It'd be great to get both of your insights and thinking at that moment in time as well, because this has been a very timely and important conversation. To everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. We appreciate you being with us. Again, this is a series put on by the Keystone Policy Center called Key Conversations. Later in the fall, our next conversation will feature Shelby Coffey, also a Keystone board member, noted journalist, senior fellow at the Freedom Forum, and former vice chair of the museum, talking about the election and the media and how things are playing out to that date. So if you are interested in joining us, please go to keystone.org, sign up for our newsletter, and you will get announcements for a registration link to join any conversation that we're conducting and any future conversation that we have. So again, Ed and Paul, a terrific conversation. It was a graduate class, Ed. And I so appreciate, Paul, the depth of knowledge and understanding that you bring in the great impactful work that your organization conducts. It's an important mission, so thank you. Again, thank you all.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah.
Of course, and
Thanks, Christine.
be safe on your travels, Paul, and thanks for tuning in from Lebanon. Thank you all again, and we hope you have a great day.